There. Well, back home, the war of words between the Premier and the Prime Minister over East-West Link continues. Yesterday, they fired off strongly worded letters to each other over Victoria's plans to abandon the project. And though Tony Abbott was in Victoria today, there was no face-to-face meeting to discuss the issue. Alison Savage reports.
A warm welcome for the Prime Minister in Horsham.
Whoopsie days.
Sorry, sir, I'm getting a selfie.
Oh, why don't we do that, eh? Oh, wow, this is nice, isn't it, eh?
But a frosty reception from Spring Street.
I'm more than happy to work with you, but be in no doubt I will never work for you and I will not be pushed around by you.
The Prime Minister's been a vocal supporter of the multi-billion-dollar East-West link. Late yesterday, he fired an angry letter to the Premier warning the government against legislating to cancel the contracts for the project, saying it could damage Australia's financial reputation overseas.
That's the last thing that people want to associate with our country, that new governments will go to the Parliament and literally abrogate people's rights.
I think Tony Abbott's the last person that should be lecturing anybody on Australia's good name overseas.
The government's locked in negotiations with the East-West Connect consortium to cancel the contract, maintaining the companies will be compensated for any costs they've incurred. The government's told the ABC the consortium has drawn down $475 million from its financiers since financial close on the contract, but it's not clear what figure could be on the table in any settlement. As tensions between the two leaders continued to rise today, the Premier revealed the Prime Minister's reaction during a recent phone conversation when he suggested the pair meet to discuss the issue face to face.
I thought he'd actually hung up at one point, but it was absolute silence.
Well, I'm always happy to meet with the Premier.
Mr Abbott spent the afternoon in Melbourne, but there was no meeting with the Premier. Alison Savage, ABC News, Melbourne.
Tony Abbott promised a $1.5 billion contribution to Melbourne's East-West link as part of his pledge to be the Infrastructure Prime Minister. But when Labor swept to power in Victoria last year, the future of the enormous project was thrown into turmoil. The new Premier, Daniel Andrews, won with a very clear message. The contract signed by the outgoing Liberal government over the East-West link would be torn up. But it isn't proving quite so easy. As Madeline Morris reports, up to $1 billion in compensation is hanging in the balance.
Every Sunday, Mary Fenelon makes the 30-minute trip from her new house in Melbourne's eastern suburbs to inner-city Collingwood, to the house she lived in for 13 years.
Sad, I always feel sad and a feeling of loss. I guess it's 9 weeks tomorrow since I moved out, and I had plenty of warning, but it doesn't matter. I kind of left something that was mine.
It's always the same ritual. She checks the mail at her old house, then heads to Mass at the nearby church she's worshipped at for nearly 2 decades.
Love you. I miss you too. Sorry I didn't get to see you. I'll come in during the week, I promise. To go out for coffee.
This is the gospel of the Lord.
Mary Fenelon has struggled to leave her old life behind since selling her house because the Victorian government was planning to build a massive freeway at her front door.
They said I had 14 days to decide or they'd take the offer off the table. Well, I didn't have a choice because if I stayed, I would not ever be able to sell the house, so we stuck there. That was obviously rigged.
Mary is one of hundreds of people who've had their lives turned upside down by Melbourne's East-West Link project. It was to be the biggest toll road project in Australia's history.
This project will be a game-changing project for Melbourne and Victoria. It will decongest Melbourne.
Melbourne is gridlocked. Roads and rail groan under the weight of an exploding population. The solution put forward by the former state coalition government was a 6-kilometre tunnel under the city, linking the Eastern Freeway to the sprawling western suburbs, the East-West Link.
No way, we're going to fight it all the way.
It was hugely controversial. The Labor opposition at first promised to go ahead with the freeway.
I'm not in the business of ripping up contracts.
Then, just 3 months out from last November's state election, Labor changed its mind, vowing to abandon the project if it came to power.
The contracts signed in these circumstances are not worth the paper they're written on.
The coalition went ahead anyway and signed a $6.8 billion contract to build the road with a consortium led by the infrastructure giant Lend-Lease.
I think both sides, both the Napthine government and the Labor opposition, played a game of political brinkmanship over this project. And that's not a good way to determine major public policy investments.
But the government didn't just sign a contract. The same day, it also signed a secret side letter guaranteeing the road builders compensation of more than $1 billion, even if a court ruled the contract was invalid.
You couldn't think of a more treacherous act by the dying hand of a dying government. And effectively what they've done is consign Victorians to potentially hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of liability.
In November, Labor swept to power, and ever since, the new government has been locked in negotiations with the consortium trying to get out of the contract, despite its pre-election mantra that the contract could be torn up.
Before the election, Mr Andrews said the contract wasn't worth the paper it was written on and no compensation would be payable. That's patently not the case. Mr Andrews said whatever he had to say to get himself elected. Now he's dealing with a mess of his own making.
Determined to avoid paying $1 billion in compensation, the government has also floated the idea of voiding the contract by an Act of Parliament, a prospect that horrifies investors.
We've had international investors ringing and asking, what does this mean for things like the privatisation of the Port of Melbourne? What does it mean for public-private partnerships elsewhere in the country? And one of the things I think it's very important that the Premier and the senior members of the Andrews government understand is that this is Victoria in the 21st century. It's not Argentina in the 80s.
And late last night, the Prime Minister and the Premier upped the ante in an exchange of terse letters. Mr Abbott pleaded with Mr Andrews to build the East-West link, saying dumping the contract would harm Australia's reputation as a good place to do business. Mr Andrews retaliated that he, unlike the Prime Minister, he said, kept his election promises. Therefore, no road would be built. Today, the Premier was giving no ground. Premier, will you now acknowledge that when you went to the election saying that the contract wasn't worth the paper it was written on, that wasn't true? It turns out that it was, and now Victorians continue to be on the hook for hundreds of millions of dollars for a road that's not going to be built?
No, I won't accept that, because what you've put to me is wrong.
It was worth the paper it was written on, though, wasn't it?
Well, you can assert that, but if you assert that, you are wrong. If only the previous government had accepted that they had no mandate to get on with this project, that it didn't stack up, that there's massive funding holes in this entire project. If they just waited a couple of weeks, then things would be much different.
The contract should not have been signed just before the election. I think the money that's going into these Lend-Lease, etc., is just outrageous. They're getting all the rewards and I'm getting the loser.